her position, since in a letter today in today's press in Northern Ireland, many victims groups have called into question her position on this issue.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I would join with him certainly in paying tribute to the unstinting and, over a very long period of time, very determined work that has been done by victims groups over many, many years in order to get us to where we are today. We aren't there yet, of course. We have to get this done by the end of May next year, so there is more work to be done, but we are at least within sight. We're on the final lap, I hope. So, absolutely, and I'm sure that he and other Northern Ireland politicians will wish to reflect those views very, very carefully in the upcoming discussions which we'll have. On the Victims Commissioner's comments, she has, I think, suffered the full force of quite a lot of people's wrath over the course of the last few days. I am pleased, Mr. Speaker, that she has issued a clarificatory statement, which I think is very important, because she has said, and I'm quoting, I'm acutely aware of the perception that this scheme is somehow drawing moral equivalence between victims and perpetrators. That is not the case. I think that is a vitally important thing for her to have clarified. It is absolutely essential that she did so. I will leave her to answer her critics herself more broadly, but I think that that central point is very good to hear expressed in such clear terms from her.
The Deputy Leader and the Knight of Lagan Valley, Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons why we're even discussing this issue now is that 21 years ago, in the Belfast Agreement signed in Good Friday 1998, sadly, not enough was done to deal with the legacy of our troubled past. Will the Minister assure us that whatever happens, and we hope for a restoration of devolved government as soon as possible, that the government will proceed with implementing the legacy proposal subject to whatever changes arise from the consultation, so we can get on with dealing with these issues and the victims can have access to proper investigation of the murders that occurred during the Troubles?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is absolutely right to say that the broader issue of the legacy of the Troubles is much, much wider than the specific point about victims' pension which we are discussing here today, and that therefore there are a whole range of other issues which have not been dealt with through the EFEF bill that we have been discussing. He will be aware, of course, because he and I have spoken about it elsewhere, that the government has just published the summary of the responses to the rather large consultation, 17,000 responses, just published the digest of what those responses said in response to the proposals about how the broader legacy issues might be dealt with. In due course, the government will then need to set out its broader reaction to that in order to take that broader canvas forward. He is absolutely right, those other issues are not going away and they need to be addressed, and promptly.
Sammy Wilson.
Mr. Speaker, if you'd called me earlier and upset the leader, I wouldn't have cared at all. Can I first of all thank the Minister for the clarification which he has given, and I think that it will be of immense relief to many people in Northern Ireland. But could I just push him a little further on this? Because there are some of those who have been involved in terrorist activity who now claim that because of what happened to them, either they were incarcerated or they were questioned by the police or they had raids on their homes, that as a result of this they have had depression and mental illnesses, etc., which they may argue qualifies them for a pension. Could he give us an assurance that it's not just those who have injured themselves physically as a result of their involvement in terrorist activity, but those who claim to have mental illness because of their involvement in terrorist activity will not qualify either?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises a broader and very important point, which is for victims who will qualify, to begin with, it is important that we also agree and understand that there are valid and very, very serious conditions which can be non-physical, and we would not want to exclude people who have ended up with mental illness as a result of being victims who are injured through no fault of their own. So we absolutely should not be excluding non-physical injuries from our calculation about how severely someone is injured and therefore whether or not they are eligible. But he is therefore also right to point out that the flip side of that will be that when we are working out who we should be excluding from the definition in order to make sure that this doesn't become a pension for terrorists. Therefore, clearly, mental illnesses and non-physical injuries need to be included in that half of the definition as well.
Mr. Gavin Robinson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm thanking the Minister for his principled and precise words that he has outlined this afternoon. He did recognise that if the institutions are restored, the amendments fall. But given that is the case, if the institutions are restored, the issue doesn't go away, and the principle still needs to run through whatever proposals emanate, be they in Belfast for Northern Ireland-based victims or indeed in GB for GB-based victims. Will he ensure and commit today that, come what may, the principles he has outlined, that we will support victims but not victim makers, will run true?
Mr. Speaker, if I can take the honourable gentleman back to the point made by the Speaker for the Opposition, who pointed out that there are 4 criteria under the Act which will apply and which we will need to work through in order to deliver the central principle which both I and now he as well have enunciated. And amongst those 4 criteria include not just how, when or where the injury was sustained. So, for example, there will be a question about whether or not we should be including people who were injured in the Canary Wharf bombings in London, but also residence or nationality as well. So clearly both those issues are factors. They are laid down on the face of the bill, and therefore, as he rightly says, they will not go away. They have to be addressed, and they will be as we work through the process of the details between now and the end of May.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, and should innocent casualties and far from innocent paramilitaries be treated the same? The answer is no, they should never, and the Minister of State has said that. So did 14 of the victims' groups say the very same thing, which is very much at odds with the Victims Commissioner. One of those victims groups is Decorum NI, who represent many of my constituents in Strangford. So will the Minister of State come with me to meet some of the actual victims and their families in my constituency sometime in the future, providing he's still in place, of course. I hope he will be. They tell me, and I state today, that the definition to equate the victims and perpetrators as the same is tantamount to spitting on the graves of those who were murdered, salting the wounds of those living with physical impairments inflicted by terrorists, and equivalent to mentally torturing those with emotional scars from being true victims of convicted murderers and evil terrorists who can never be held in the same level or capacity. I welcome the Minister of State's comments, but I also want to make sure that we keep true to it.
Mr. Speaker, absolutely, and I should thank both him and others who've been kind enough to say they hope I will continue in place. I'm bathing in the love, and it's very kind of him, and of course, if I am in place, I'll be delighted to come meet the group that he described.
Thank you. Order statement, the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs, Secretary Jeremy Hunt.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I'll make a statement about the situation in the Gulf. At approximately 4 p.m. UK time on Friday, Iranian forces intercepted the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero in the Strait of Hormuz. The ship was surrounded by 4 fast boats from the Revolutionary Guard, supported by 1 helicopter. Iranian footage showed masked gunmen in desert camouflage descending from the helicopter onto the deck of the Stena Impero. HMS Montrose, a Royal Navy Type 23 frigate currently deployed in the Gulf, tried to come to the tanker's aid. She repeatedly warned the Iranians by radio that their actions were illegal, but Montrose was unable to reach the scene in time. 9 days earlier, she'd successfully intercepted an attempt to board another tanker, British Heritage. But this time, Montrose was not given the notice of passage requested that would have allowed her to reach the scene more quickly. This, however, in no way excuses the illegal actions of the intruders, who took control of Stena Impero and compelled her to steer towards the Iranian port of Bandar Abbas, where she's now being held. The tanker had a crew of 23 from various countries, including India, the Philippines, Russia, and Latvia. No Britons were on board, and there are no reports of any injuries. The vessel's owners have confirmed that Stena Impero was exercising her legal right of transit passage when she was intercepted. She was passing through the Strait of Hormuz in the westbound traffic lane inside Omani territorial waters in full compliance with international law and the rules of navigation. The tanker's automatic identification system was switched on, and her position was publicly available. So let us be absolutely clear, under international law, Iran had no right to obstruct the ship's passage, let alone board her. It was therefore an act of state piracy, which the House will have no hesitation in condemning. Even more worryingly, this incident was a flagrant breach of the principle of free navigation on which the global trading system and world economy ultimately depends. I therefore urge Iran to release the Stena Impero and her crew and observe the rules that safeguard commercial shipping and benefit Iran as much as any other country. Iran has tried to present this as a tit-for-tat incident following the government of Gibraltar's action on the 4th of July to enforce EU sanctions by preventing the Iranian chartered tanker Grace 1 from supplying oil to Syria. But there is simply no comparison between Iran's illegal seizure of a vessel inside a recognised shipping lane, where the Stena Impero had every right to be, and the enforcement of EU sanctions against a tanker that had freely navigated into the waters of a British overseas territory. So since the 4th of July, we've made strenuous efforts to resolve the Grace 1 issue. On the 13th of July, I spoke by phone to the Iranian Foreign Minister, Jawad Zarif, and also made clear in public that we would be content with the release of Grace 1 if there were sufficient guarantees the oil would not go to any entities sanctioned by the EU. But instead of responding constructively, Iran chose to seize the Stena Impero. So we must now take appropriate action to support the safe passage of vessels through the Strait of Hormuz. As well as speaking again to my Iranian counterpart, I've also spoken this weekend and today to the foreign ministers of Oman, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Finland, Spain and Denmark. COBRA meetings were held this morning and throughout the weekend, and the chargé d'affaires at the Iranian embassy in London was summoned to the Foreign Office on Saturday to receive a formal protest. I can today update the House on further action we are taking. Firstly, the Department of Transport has raised the security level for British flag shipping to level 3, advising against all passage in Iranian waters and, for the moment, in the entire Strait of Hormuz. Secondly, because freedom of navigation is a vital interest of every nation, we will now seek to put together a European-led maritime protection mission to support safe passage of both crew and cargo in this vital region. We've had constructive discussions with a number of countries in the last 48 hours, and we will discuss later this week the best way to complement this with recent US proposals in this area. The new force will be focused on free navigation, bearing in mind that 1/5 of the world's oil, 1/4 of its liquefied natural gas, and trade worth $500 billion passes through the Strait of Hormuz every year. It will not be part of the US maximum pressure policy on Iran because we remain committed to preserving the Iran nuclear agreement. Thirdly, while we will seek to establish this mission as quickly as possible, the government has in the meantime dispatched HMS Duncan, a Type 45 destroyer, to take over from HMS Montrose, and she will arrive in the region by the 29th of July, a week from today. Fourthly, we'll ask all British flagged ships to give us notice of any intention to pass through the Strait of Hormuz to enable us to offer the best protection we can. We'll then advise them of the safest way to transit, which may involve travelling in convoy. Finally, we're strengthening measures to protect ships flying the flags of other countries, but which have British crew on board. Mr. Speaker, about 1,300 ships appear on the UK ship register. The combined British Red Ensign fleet is the 9th largest in the world, and on an average day, 2 or 3 ships belonging to the Red Ensign group pass through the Strait of Hormuz. The Gulf spans an area of nearly 100,000 square miles. HMS Montrose covers an operating area of some 19,000 nautical miles, and so far has escorted 30 merchant vessels through the strait during 17 separate transits, travelling 4,800 nautical miles in the process. It is, of course, not possible for the Royal Navy to provide escorts for every single ship, or indeed eliminate all risks of piracy. but those risks can be substantially reduced if commercial shipping companies cooperate fully with instructions from the Department of Transport, which we strongly encourage them to do. These changes, both short and medium term, are made possible because of the commitment this government has already made to increase our security presence in the Gulf, including the opening in April last year of the first permanent British naval facility in the Gulf for over 40 years. This establishment in Bahrain now hosts HMS Montrose along with 4 mine countermeasure vessels and 1 supply ship. Finally, let me say that it is with a heavy heart that we are announcing this increased international presence in the Gulf, because the focus of our diplomacy has been on de-escalating tensions in the hope that such changes would not be necessary. We do not seek confrontation with Iran. We've taken every available opportunity to reduce misunderstanding whilst standing by our rock-solid commitment to the international rule of law, which is the foundation of global peace and prosperity. But we must also react to the world around us as it is and not how we would wish it to be. So if Iran continues on this dangerous path, they must accept the price will be a larger Western military presence in the waters along their coastline, not because we wish to increase tensions, but simply because freedom of navigation is a principle which Britain and its allies will always defend. And I commend this statement to the House.
Fabian Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Foreign Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Let me start by passing on the apologies of the Shadow Foreign Secretary that she cannot be here to respond herself, but as many will know, she's still at home recovering from the injuries she received after being knocked off her bike on Friday, and I'm sure we will all wish her well. May I also take the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to pay tribute to the outgoing Minister for Europe and the Americas, the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton. He has served the Foreign Office with diligence and distinction in bad times and good, and he certainly can be forgiven for fearing that the bad times are about to return. But we thank him for the spirit in which he engaged in our parliamentary debates, and we look forward to him continuing to make those contributions from the back benches. I'd also like to add that in the unfortunate event that this Foreign Secretary's final appearance in his current role is today, we thank him too for the welcoming change in tone and the very welcome change in work ethic that he's brought to that great office of state, not least on the issue of Iran that we're discussing today. Mr. Speaker, Iran's actions in recent weeks in the Strait of Hormuz have been utterly unacceptable and should be condemned from all sides. Our thoughts, first and foremost, are with the 23 crew members on board the Stena Impero, and of course their families, who are facing this period of concern and uncertainty. And Mr. Speaker, we all know why these events have been taking place, because just like the tanker war in the 1980s, there is a simple and ruthless logic being applied by the Iranian hardliners who are now in the ascendancy in Tehran, just as they were 30 years ago. And it simply says, if you try and stop our oil supplies, we will stop yours. An escalation of tit-for-tat rhetoric and action that has been sadly so predictable and to some extent inevitable since the United States walked away from the Iran nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions not limited to the US, but in theory to any company or country that continues to deal with Iran. And I say in theory, Mr. Speaker, because as we all know, those countries like China, powerful enough to ignore the Trump administration's demands, have continued to import oil and gas from Iran while Washington turns a blind eye. But that brings us to the specific issue of the seizure of the Grace 1 oil tanker and the unacceptable retaliatory action that Iran has taken against Stena Impero. We know from the Spanish newspaper El País that the US told the Madrid government 48 hours in advance that Grace 1 was headed for the Iberian Peninsula, which could also explain why, 36 hours in advance, the Gibraltar government introduced new legislation to shore up the legal basis for the seizure taking place in its waters. So may I ask the Foreign Secretary to confirm whether the US was also the source of our information regarding the tanker's course, whether it is correct that they asked us to seize it, and whether their primary basis for that request was the tanker's destination to Syria, or that its origin was Iran. And if it's correct, Mr. Speaker, that we knew full 2 days in advance that this action was going to be taken, why on earth, a full 17 days later, was a British-flagged tanker left so hopelessly unprotected in the Strait of Hormuz, when anyone with any understanding of this issue could see that this was exactly how the Iranians would respond to the seizure of their own? And when the measures the Foreign Secretary's announced today, which are very welcome, could have been put in place a full 20 days before now, why was the government's eye so patently off the crystal ball? And while I'd like the Foreign Secretary to go into more practical detail about how the government plans to resolve the Grace 1 Stena Impero impasse, we must also address the wider question, which is how to de-escalate the tension with Iran. Stop this tit-for-tat cycle of actions. Get the nuclear deal back on track, and use that as the foundation which it previously promised to be, to address all the other concerns we have about Iran, not least the continued detention of Nazanin Zahawi Ratcliffe and other British dual nationals. So let me close, Mr. Speaker, by asking the Foreign Secretary, setting aside the need to enforce sanctions against the Assad regime, with which we wholeheartedly agree, can he tell us what the government is doing to persuade the Trump administration to drop its sanctions against Iran? Sanctions which breach the international agreement which we, the US, and other countries worked so hard to achieve, and sanctions which have given the hardliners in Tehran the excuse they have always craved to return to the strategy of isolation and aggression, and themselves breach the terms of the nuclear agreement. An agreement which was one of the great diplomatic achievements of this current century, and an agreement, Mr. Speaker, which we must all strive to get back on track before this escalation of tension reaches the point of no return.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And first of all, can I say that from this side of the House, we wholeheartedly endorse what the Shadow Foreign Minister said about the Shadow Foreign Secretary, who we wish every success in having a rapid recovery after her very unfortunate bicycle accident. And I think that will be something we all feel on this side of the House. I also want to thank him for his generous comments to me about my time as Foreign Secretary, of course without any sting in the tail, but I particularly want to thank him when he was comparing me to my predecessor for making those comments carefully after 5 o'clock when the leadership contest for the Conservative Party closed, because it might not have helped me in that contest if people thought that he thought that I was a better Foreign Secretary. Can I add my thanks to the brilliant service to British diplomacy made by the Right Honourable Member for Rutland and Melton, who was an outstanding Foreign Office Minister. He will be greatly missed inside King Charles Street, but not for long if tomorrow's result is the upset that I am hoping for. Let me return to the substance of what the Honourable Gentleman said. First of all, on the detention of Grace 1 by the Gibraltar authorities, I want to be absolutely clear that the United Kingdom did not endorse that detention by the Gibraltarian authorities because of a request by the US. We did it because it was transiting oil through the waters of a British overseas territory in contravention of EU sanctions against Syria. And we have been absolutely clear that our issue was the destination of that oil, which is President Assad's regime, because a fundamental objective of British foreign policy has been to make sure that we redraw the international red lines against the use of chemical weapons, which Assad has so tragically broken. So that is the reason, and that is also why we have sought to de-escalate the situation by making it clear to Iran that whatever our disagreements with that regime, we would support the release of that tanker if we could receive guarantees that that oil was not going to Syria. And we made that offer in public as well as in private, so that they would know we were absolutely serious about it. In terms of what we have done since the 4th of July, when that detention happened, there has been a huge amount of work. But let me tell him, on the security side, the Ministry of Defence have been extremely active. They've had officials posted at the Department for Transport, the dispatch of HMS Duncan, the raising of the threat level to level 3, the enhanced activity from HMS Montrose, which has done 17 transits in recent days for 30 vessels, including 16 which had the red ensign, 26 hours of helicopter flying by the Wildcat helicopters. And on the FCO side, we have been doing a huge amount to try and de-escalate the situation, including calls to my Iranian counterpart, my US counterpart, Mike Pompeo, the Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who I also met, and attendance at the Foreign Affairs Council on the 15th of July, where I met the French Foreign Minister, amongst many others. So there has been a lot of things that have been happening. But with regard to his substantive point, I think it is important, if we are going to de-escalate this situation, that we do not conflate what happened both in Gibraltar and to the Stena Impero with the JCPOA and the different approach that we have taken to the Trump administration on the Iran nuclear deal. On most foreign policy issues, we are absolutely at one with the United States. We consider them our closest ally, indeed the alliance with the United States, to be the foundation of global peace and prosperity since the Second World War. We do have a difference of opinion on this issue, but we are also absolutely clear that when it comes to freedom of navigation, there can be no compromise, and that is why the solution that we are proposing to the House this afternoon is one that brings in a much broader alliance of countries, including other countries like us that have a different approach to the Iran nuclear deal. But the Iranians must understand that there will be no compromise on freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz. This is absolutely essential for the global economy and for global freedom of navigation, and this country will not blink in that respect.
Mr. Ian Duncan Smith.
Speaker, I'll start by welcoming absolutely what my right honourable friend has said. There is absolutely no question that it is the Iranians who have caused this problem, not the British, and therefore any linking of this would be quite wrong, and I commend what he said on that. But I do also want to ask him a very simple question, and maybe it's one he's unable to answer at this point. We've known for some time that therefore there was a heightened problem in the Gulf, and that our strongest ally was there with some force. Why was it that we did not request or agree with them that in the interim, while we are getting the right resources into place, that they themselves did not act in concert with us to protect some of our shipping, as they said they could have done?
Well, I always listen to my right honourable friend very carefully on all defence matters, and I want to reassure him that those close behind-the-scenes discussions with the United States as to how we can improve maritime security have been happening throughout this period. So those missions that Montrose has been on, the 17 transits that it's done, would not have been possible without US logistical support. And they have indeed made a proposal about how we could enhance maritime security more generally. They actually asked us to contribute to a maritime force on the 24th of June, which became a formal request on the 30th of June, and then they briefed NATO allies formally on it and the Washington Diplomatic Corps last Thursday and last Friday, and we will be talking to them about it later this week. And so we think that what they're saying is helpful and important, and we will be seeking to coordinate any European efforts on freedom of navigation with anything that the US does. But we want our contribution, the UK's contribution, to be to make that coalition as broad as possible.
Stephen Gittins.
Mr. Speaker, can I wish the Shadow Foreign Secretary a very speedy recovery as well, and also congratulate the member for Easton Bartonshire on her election to be the new Liberal Democrat leader. I look forward to continuing to work with her in opposing his Tory government. I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement. I'd also like to thank him for the diligence and seriousness that he, unlike his predecessor, has brought to this role. It might be 5:20, but I'm not sure that would have swung it for him, regardless of when I'd said it. But I'd like to thank him nevertheless. Can I also pay tribute to the member for Rutland and Melton for the work that he's put into it. We've not always agreed, but I'd like to thank him for the collegiate nature, and where we have agreed, we've been able to work together as well. This isn't a great time for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office to be falling apart, but I can entirely sympathise with the reasons that he's set out today. Mr. Speaker, Iran's actions are completely unacceptable. Those, along with the jailing of the innocent mum, Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe, should tell us all what kind of regime we're dealing with here. Can I say to the Foreign Secretary, regardless who holds this post in the coming days, they must be fully on top of their brief when it comes to Iran. We must have a full complement of staff in the Foreign Office who are able to speak frankly on Iran. The damage done by the Foreign Secretary's predecessor has illustrated what happens when you're not fully briefed when dealing with Iran. Now, right now, there's a need for engagement, cool heads and a multilateral approach, and I'm glad to see the start of that with the Foreign Secretary's statement today. So can he set out what talks he's having with our partners, over and above the ones he's already set out, but in particular along the lines of what's happening with the Iran nuclear deal as well? That's a critical piece of work that will need to be done. Now, there are concerns that this administration has taken its eye off the ball, and certainly that the UK has been ill-prepared for this. Can he set out in a bit more detail why this wasn't foreseen, what actions he's taking to look at that again? This is a dangerous situation, and there must be a clear understanding of what's going on, as well as looking at ways to de-escalate the situation. And finally, Mr. Speaker, Northern Marine is headquartered in Clydebank, in the constituency of my honourable friend, the member for West Dunbartonshire. He's been working incredibly hard on this, and I hope this office will continue to cooperate with my honourable friend. Can I also say that we're thinking about the families of those affected at Northern Marine? And finally, can I thank the naval personnel for their service, and in particular those on HMS Montrose as well?
Hear, hear.
Secretary. Well, I'd like to thank him for his comments, and actually gives me a chance to say that I lived for a couple of years as a member of a naval family in Rosyth, and so I too, and I know everyone on this side of the House, thanks the naval officers and their families for the great courage and service they're showing to our country at a very challenging and worrying time. He also mentioned Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, and we understand from Richard Ratcliffe, Nazanin's husband, that she has been moved back to Evin prison in Tehran, which we think is a positive sign. It sounds like the way that she was detained for a week without being able to have any access to her family was totally unacceptable, and I'm afraid all too predictable from the Iranian regime. He will understand that I am seeking not to make any linkage between these broader military and security issues and the situation Nazanin faces, because I don't think that would help get Nazanin home. But I know the whole House is absolutely clear that whatever disagreements we have with Iran, an innocent woman must not be the victim, and she must be allowed to come home. He asked about the Iran nuclear deal, and I think this is an area where the Trump administration has a genuine and honest difference of opinion with us, because it isn't a perfect deal. It was a deal that allowed sanctions relief for Iran, but did not prevent Iran supporting its proxies in Lebanon, Yemen, Syria and Iraq, and allowed Iran to carry on destabilizing the region. And that was why the Trump administration took the course they did. We, however, feel that given that 4 years ago they were 18 months away from acquiring a nuclear weapon, it is a huge diplomatic achievement that Iran does not today have a nuclear weapon, and the Middle East would have been much more dangerous if they had. So that is why we are seeking to preserve it, and we are being clear to them that this recent breach of the uranium enrichment levels is not acceptable, but we are giving them the space to bring themselves back into compliance with the JCPOA before we formally pull the plug on it, and that is what we hope happens.
Sir Michael Fallon.
My right honourable friend confirmed that both the supply of oil to Syria and the capture of a British flag tanker are both criminal acts for which Iran cannot be excused and do require the more robust response that he has now announced to the House including the policing of an international waterway by a multinational task force. In view of what he's just said, would he agree with me that whatever view one takes of the American administration's course of action over the joint agreement, it wouldn't make sense to exclude the American Navy from participation in that multinational task force?
The only one got any answer.
Well, my right honourable friend speaks with enormous experience on these matters because of his own background as Defence Secretary, and I can assure him that we would not exclude or seek to exclude the American Navy because they have a vital role, for example, in the refuelling of our own ships, the communication system, the command and control system, and indeed the intelligence support. So we would always operate in partnership with our American allies in these situations, whatever difference of opinion we might have on the Iran nuclear deal.
Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Back in June, the government's view was that naval escorts for ships passing through the Straits of Hormuz would not be appropriate because they would be seen as provocative and escalatory, and therefore I very much welcome the announcement the Foreign Secretary has made today in response to Iran's seizure of the Stena Impero and his announcement of a proposal for a European-led force, a reminder to the whole House of the benefits of European cooperation, and we have a very good example in another anti-piracy operation, in Operation Atalanta, which has been very successful off the east coast of Africa. Could he tell the House how quickly he expects this mission to be established, and will it have sufficient resources to protect all of the ships, which we now know are vulnerable as they pass through the Straits of Hormuz?
Secretary. I can tell him a little bit of the answer to that, which is that it's not going to be a sudden switching on and off. There's going to be a gradual build-up of presence because it takes time for ships to get to this region from all over the world. But HMS Duncan will arrive on the 29th of July, or possibly even before that, as the first step in this process. But we are having substantive discussions later this week with allies from across the world in which things like the timescales will become a lot clearer, and I'd be happy to write to him after that.
Sir Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, may I say that I entirely support what the Foreign Secretary has said and the actions he intends to take, but may I ask him three very particular points. The Straits of Hormuz must be the most overflown and monitored sea area in the entire world, and I would be grateful, therefore, for these answers. Firstly, when did the Stena Impero leave Fujairah? Secondly, what time was HMS Montrose first alerted to her passage? And finally, what advice did the Stena ship seek before she sailed of the British government?
Thank you. The first question I will write him on, because I don't have it to hand, the exact time and date that it left Fujairah. The warning that HMS Montrose had was 60 minutes, which was not long enough, and we ask all ship owners to give us at least 24 hours notice. We didn't get it in this case, but that doesn't excuse a criminal act of piracy, and that's the point I would say. But we do hope now that all ship owners will cooperate fully in giving us the notice we need to give them the protection we're able.
Tulip Siddiq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hear what the Foreign Secretary has said about not linking the situation in Hormuz with that of my constituent Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. But with the best will in the world, the Foreign Secretary must be aware that the Iranians have previously used my constituent as a bargaining chip, and the Foreign Secretary must be aware that only last week the Supreme Leader promised retribution for the dispute over Grace 1. As the Foreign Secretary said, Nazanin has been transferred to prison after a week in the mental health hospital, where she was handcuffed to her bed, guarded by someone who was armed. Her ward was sealed off, she was not allowed any contact with her family, and then transferred back to prison. Will the Foreign Secretary reassure me that he's taking proper steps to ensure that this situation does not mean that my constituent's chances of freedom are further ended, and that she will be returning back to West Hampstead with her family?
Well, can I take this opportunity to thank the Honourable Lady for her campaigning her very, very diligent campaigning for the release of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe. And I was trying to be very careful with my words just now to say that I always try to avoid linkage between the two cases, because inevitably with a country like Iran, our relations go up and down, and I would never want an innocent woman to suffer as a result of the ebb and flow of those relations. But of course I can't guarantee that Iran doesn't seek to make that linkage itself, and I think it would be completely wrong of it to do so. I'm afraid the stories that she told me about the conditions under which Nazanin were detained are stories I've heard, and I think they're totally shocking. And we hoped, and I think she probably hoped, that it might be good news that she was being transferred to a hospital for help with certain of her medical conditions. But it now looks like that wasn't the case, and I think that is extremely shocking. And all I will reassure her is that every time I talk to the Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, I bring up Nazanin's case. I talk about it in as much detail as I am able, because I want him to know that we will never ever forget the fate of even one British national being treated the way that Nazanin is.
Alistair Burt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and also thank my right honourable friend, the member for Rutland, for his extraordinary work and his companionship in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office over so many years. Mr. Speaker, whilst it's absolutely correct to concentrate on recent events, and it must be right to ensure safe passage of ships through the Gulf, and that Iran must face up to its responsibilities, does he not agree with me that there's no doubt that this is just the latest symptom of the long-running issue between Iran and its neighbours, and that arguably the situation surrounding the discussions over the nuclear deal were even more serious than those today, because the pressure was on to seek a nuclear weapon, and somehow the negotiations found a way to establish a relationship that de-escalated that. If that was the case, what does my right honourable think might be the trigger to start those negotiations again? Because the linkages are all there in Tehran, and we need to recognise that dealing with the cause as well as the symptoms is absolutely vital.
Well, we have got a plethora of distinguished former FCO ministers on the back benches today, and I'm just grateful that we have the Work and Pension Secretary and the Defence Secretary on the front bench here, otherwise I might be a bit lonely. But he speaks with a lot of wisdom and experience of relations with Iran, and I think one of the things that he navigated extremely successfully in his time in the FCO was the fact that you feel like you're talking to two different groups of people. You've got the government of Iran and the foreign minister, who are usually quite reasonable when you talk to them, and then the people you never get to talk to, which is the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, who are always kept at a distance. And it's tempting to say there's no point talking to the foreign ministry in Iran because they don't have any influence over the government. But it's also wrong, because they do have access that we don't have, and they can present a more moderate case, and that's why we continue with these contacts. And I would say that the best hope that we have going forward is the fact that Foreign Minister Zarif did propose a basis on which to restart negotiations with the United States for a different version of the nuclear deal. That was rejected by the United States, but the fact that that language has started to emerge in the last couple of weeks is a sign, I think, that there is some hope of a negotiated end to this.
John Brake.
Yeah, first of all, could I pass on my best wishes to the Shadow Foreign Secretary as well? As a cyclist myself, I know how vulnerable cyclists are in London. And can I also apologise for the absence of my honourable friend, the member for East Dunbartonshire, who's been detained by a leadership contest announcement in which he has been appointed or elected as the leader of the Liberal Democrats. And I'm very pleased that that has not required any Liberal Democrats to resign in the way that we've clearly seen some very respectable... I know other members may regret that, but in the way that the leadership of the Conservative Party has indeed required some very sensible ministers, such as the member for Rutland Melton and indeed the member for Runnymede, to resign their positions. In relation to Iran, clearly it is time for cool heads, and I welcome very much the fact that we have the current Foreign Secretary in post, and he's made it clear that we are not up for military action. But could I ask him whether he thinks that discussions need to take place now about the composition of our fleet and the size of it? And does he also agree with me that we are not in a war with Iran, but clearly we are in a propaganda war? And would he be able to say a little bit about what the government are going to do to counter the image that the Iranians are portraying of perhaps the ship going off course and colliding with another vessel?
Is that the right honourable gentleman is so pleased that none of his 11 parliamentary colleagues, well, himself and the successful leader included, has resigned. But I know he's very happy, and I'm very happy to join in his happiness for himself. The Foreign Secretary.
Well, let me take this opportunity to congratulate the Honourable Lady for East Dunbartonshire on her election as Liberal Democrat leader, and I look forward to having cordial relations with her as a fellow party leader if I am successful tomorrow in the election. And with respect to his point about the war of words on news, this was actually one of the times when the Iranians didn't really bother to pretend that they were peddling a myth about the cause of the seizure of Stena Impero, because they changed their story 3 times in the space of about 24 hours, and they are now not making any pretense at all that this is, in their view, a tit-for-tat seizure. And that is why we have to be very clear about the difference between a legal detention of a ship with oil bound for Syria versus this wholly illegal act of state piracy.
Right, and typically gracious of the Foreign Secretary that he congratulated the Honourable Member for East Dunbartonshire upon her election, and I myself do so. I wish her every possible success in the important work that she now has to undertake. Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Foreign Secretary accept that the taking of hostages and the flouting of international law has been the signature strategy of Iran ever since the Islamic Revolution in 1979? If he does accept that, was it not entirely predictable and indeed predicted that by impounding this Iranian ship, however legally justified that was, the consequence would be an attempt to retaliate by grabbing a British vessel? What consideration was given before the original decision was taken to the adequacy of the number of ships in the Gulf, either ours or our allies, and what attempts were made to persuade vessels that had to navigate the straits that they should do so in small convoys, which would at least enable 2 or at most 3 frigates to protect a larger number of ships, whereas sailing independently and separately meant 1 or more was bound to be seized?
Well, I think he is right. And we did foresee that this could be one of the reactions from the Iranian government, and that's why we took a number of steps after the detention in Gibraltar on the 4th of July, including the dispatch of HMS Duncan, a lot of extra activity from HMS Montrose, escorting 30 vessels over the last few days, a number of which were British flagged. So there has been a lot of additional activity, but we wanted to do it in a way that was not red rag to a bull, and we wanted to do it in a way that didn't end up with even bigger consequences than the ones we've faced, and to give diplomatic channels a chance to work. I think it was the right thing to start that way, but regrettably Iran has not chosen to follow the path that we hoped, and so that is why we're taking much more robust action today.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I share the Foreign Secretary's concerns about the possibility that tensions will escalate and that the region may descend into conflict. And that's why I think it's so important that we're clear about the legality of the decision to detain the Grace 1. So can I press the Foreign Secretary on 2 points? Can he tell us a little bit more about the legal basis, as Carl Bildt, who is the co-chair of the, as he will know, European Council on Foreign Relations, has described it as intriguing, and I would like to know a bit more about that, but also, is he confident that we are, as a country and the European Union as a union, consistently applying those European Union sanctions against Syria, as we should? I agree with them, but are we consistently applying them? So there's no room for Foreign Secretary Zarif to call into question our motives.
Well, intelligent questions, and I'll try to do justice to them in my answer. As I understand it, it is a requirement of EU law that if a load destined for somewhere that it should not be receiving cargo in breach of sanctions goes through an EU port or EU waters, then we have an obligation to seize that cargo, just as a matter of international law, and that is what has happened. Now, what Foreign Minister Zarif tries to argue is that, unlike the United States, we do not support extraterritoriality in terms of the application of sanctions. But that was not the case, because this ship sailed into Gibraltarian waters. So you could argue that it would not have been consistent for us had the ship been seized outside Gibraltarian waters. But in this case, it was inside.
Mr. Desmond Swain.
Iran is going unpunished, isn't it?
Isn't it? Isn't it?
Commendably brief, Mr. Speaker. And I think the answer to that question is no, because I don't think that Iran can possibly want an increased Western naval presence in the Strait of Hormuz, which is right in its backyard. And that is the consequence of what they have decided to do with the Stena Impero.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
And can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his statement, and also thank him for his service in his current role, and for the way that he has carried out those duties, not just on the big international set-piece occasions and so on, but I know of his own deeply personal and intense commitment to the welfare of UK citizens across the world, and particularly those who have been detained, not just the high-profile cases either, so I thank him for that. And on this latest incident by Iran, it comes, as he mentioned, the destabilising influence of Iran in the Middle East and elsewhere, and the support for terrorist proxies. What is the UK government doing, along with allies, to get to grips with Iran and its approach to the rule of international law and everything else that it's doing?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for the generous way that he asked his question. And I think the answer to that question is that precisely because of that destabilising approach to many parts of the most dangerous and unstable region in the world, whilst we do not agree with the US approach to the Iran nuclear deal, we do try to support them in every way when they ask us to help them in checking the activities, for example, of Hezbollah in Lebanon, which we have prescribed in this country because we do think that they are a terrorist organisation, and we have to recognise that in British law. But likewise with the work that we do with the American military in Syria and in Iraq and in Yemen. Our approach to Yemen as well has been to try and separate the Houthis from their Iranian paymasters. So that's why I think it's important that we recognise that whilst we might not agree with the tactics, the strategic approach that the United States is taking as to the long-term solution in this region is for Iran to cease that destabilising activity.
Mr. David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Kingdom of Bahrain generously hosts HMS Jufair, the base from which Montrose and other Royal Naval vessels operate. Its role in the Gulf is crucial, and in recent years, Bahrain itself has been subject to destabilisation by the Iranian regime. Will my right honourable friend take the opportunity today to acknowledge the value that this country places upon the support it receives from Bahrain and the obligations it owes to that country?
I'm very happy to do that. We have a memorandum of understanding with the Kingdom of Bahrain. We are incredibly grateful for the support they give us in allowing us to host HMS Jufair, and in fact that is the first permanent naval presence that we've had in the Middle East since 1935, so it's a very big step that we opened it last year.
Chris Bryant.
I too warmly commend the work of the Right Honourable Member for Rutland, though I think it's a bit over the top to resign from office just so as to prevent appearing before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee tomorrow afternoon. But on a serious point, the UK's position on Iran has always been subtly different from that of the United States of America, even though they're our closest ally. It's partly because of our historic relations with ancient Persia. But more importantly, even on the night that George Bush declared Iran a member of the Axis of Evil, we were actually trying to send a new ambassador, or an ambassador for the first time for many years, to Tehran. And that ended up, and the American position ended up scuppering our position. So I just wonder, how do we make sure in the coming months that whilst we maintain our strong alliance with the United States of America, we still maintain our independence of thought in relation to Iran?
Well, it's a very fair question, and the truth is that we have to do that by being very frank with the Trump administration when we disagree with them and why we disagree with them. And I think that under the surface, the positions are a bit closer than they might look, in the simple sense that I've actually had a number of conversations with President Trump himself about his concerns about what would happen if that region became nuclearized. And so I don't think the United States is indifferent to the nuclear threat in that region, and they've started to talk about that recently a lot. So we use our influence, I suppose, in private circles as much as we can to try and get a meeting of minds.
He's just left.
Anne-Marie Trevelyan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure we'd all agree that our elite Royal Navy forces, our Royal Marines, known to be the best in the world, should be commended for taking their role in enforcing these EU sanctions seriously and effectively. But it does surprise me, Mr. Speaker, that since the Iranians made it clear there would be tit-for-tat retaliation for blocking tanker Grace 1, that we have not yet seen other EU navies coming to our Royal Navy's assistance in policing the Strait of Hormuz for commercial shipping. So could the Foreign Secretary give the House more information on when we will see this burden sharing from our EU allies?
Thank you. Well, what she says is close to my heart as the son of a naval officer, a phrase I have been known to use in the last few weeks, one or two times, and an entrepreneur, but that is perhaps not relevant to this afternoon's statement. What I would say to her is that she makes a very important point, and the Defence Secretary has been talking to the Defence Ministers of France, the Netherlands, Norway and others about more burden sharing within the EU. And the reason that we've constructed the proposal that we have in the way we have today is precisely because we are trying to encourage more European involvement in the issue of maritime security, because it is in the European interest.
Dr. Rupa Haq.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the world witnesses the horror of this dangerous 3D real-life game of battleships, can I relay to the Foreign Secretary, he might be more this time tomorrow, the concerns of my Iranian diaspora constituents who have relatives nearest and dearest caught up in this, people like children who are unable to access vital medicines because of the sanctions imposed by Trump and Bolton in vengeance because they didn't like their predecessors. And can I urge him to do all he can in his power to condemn and rectify these cruel hardships suffered by ordinary Iranians on the ground, as well as his decisive actions on the high seas?
Well, I actually do commend her for staying in touch with the Iranian diaspora in this country, who I think remind us that at their heart, many Iranians fundamentally do understand our values and want to find a way to accommodate Iran in the modern world. And Iran is a great country and a great civilization, and we ought to be able to find a way to resolve our differences. But there is this particular issue at the heart of it, which we've discussed with the Right Honourable Leader of the DUP just now, which is this support for destabilising activity across the Middle East, which is already the most dangerous region in the world. And that is the thing that we have to address if we're going to solve this.
John Barron.
Given that the risk of seizure was foreseen, given that 95% of goods entering the UK is by sea, does the Foreign Secretary agree that a Royal Navy of fewer than 20 ships is not up to the task, that we need to spend more on our defence? because no matter how capable a ship, it cannot be in more than one place at a time.
Secretary. Well, I might be straying slightly from my brief as Foreign Secretary, but it won't surprise the honourable gentleman to know that I am a supporter of increased spending on our armed forces. I think we have to recognise that we had in many ways a golden period after the fall of the Berlin Wall when there was a peace dividend and we were able to reduce defence spending. But now we have to recognise there are increased dangers in the world, both in the Middle East and because Russia has become much more aggressive than it was previously. And I think that the Navy, in particular, has become too small. So I hope whoever the next Prime Minister is will reflect carefully on what we can do to bolster our great Royal Navy.
Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom is home to somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 Iranian nationals and their immediate families, many of whom are here because of their opposition either to the current regime or to its equally oppressive predecessors. In the current climate of extreme intolerance, what are the government doing to make sure that these Iranian nationals who are here legally, who are innocent of any crime, are not victimised or targeted because of the crimes committed by the government that they've escaped from?
Well, I hope that if he comes across any examples of that, that he will let us, and particularly let the Home Office and the Department for Communities and Local Government know, because they are extremely welcome. They make a tremendous contribution to our country. The vast majority of them have now become British citizens, and they make a tremendous contribution to our country.
Sarah Newton.
Mr. Speaker, I welcome my right honourable friend's prescient remarks in recent weeks about the need to expand our naval presence.
Exactly.
To help with this, would my right honourable friend ask the Defence Secretary to change the classification of our much valued RFAs to warships, as our allies do, so that we can bring forward the building of planned new ships in the UK?
Secretary. I have just asked the Defence Secretary that very question, to which the answer is yes.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I agree with what the Secretary of State said about the importance of freedom of navigation. So can I ask what guidance has been issued to escorting vessels about the use of force in defence of that principle?
I hope he will understand that we don't discuss the rules of engagement publicly for very obvious reasons, but we are always doing everything we can to make sure that they are able to do what it takes to keep vessels safe.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend for his statement? I do find it slightly intriguing that the lack of resources, bearing in mind what was going on in the Gulf. And from what he said, can you confirm, it sounds like we are almost trying to appease Iran or fearing a reaction from Iran by sending too many resources there. If that is the case, perhaps another deterrent would be to put troops on these ships. I don't know where we are with that, and perhaps he could inform the House about that move as well.
Secretary.
Can I reassure him that this is absolutely not about appeasing Iran. It is about trying to see if there is a diplomatic avenue to prevent the seizure of British ships and giving the space for that diplomatic avenue to work, whilst recognising that if that fails, and I'm afraid it has failed because a British ship has been seized, we are going to have to take much more robust military approach. So that is the approach that we've taken, but we wanted to give that diplomatic window. We have considered the idea that he mentioned to this House, but we have rejected it because we think it would make those ships a target and we would have the risk of Royal Marines being taken as hostage, which would create an even greater crisis.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank the Secretary of State for his statement today and for all the hard work that he's done and hopefully will continue to do as well. The Veterans Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Bournemouth East, stated on TV yesterday that the Royal Navy needs to be built up, needs to be reinforced and needs to be strengthened in the Gulf and indeed across the world. Until such times as that happens, will the Secretary of State work alongside other countries in the Gulf, for example Saudi Arabia and perhaps the United Arab Emirates and others, to provide the policing and the protection of all ships in the Straits of Hormuz?
Absolutely. We want our allies in the Gulf to get involved in support of freedom of navigation, as we do other countries outside Europe like Australia that have expressed an interest in being supported.
Mr. Oliver, yield.
The Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Foreign Secretary are well known for their effective use of soft power, and of course we had the index of soft power. But does he agree with me, and can I thank him, that that doesn't mean that we don't need increased defence spending, because as a major maritime nation we have duties in the world which require a larger navy.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I do agree with him and thank him for his question. And I think, just to add to my earlier comments, I do think at the point of Brexit, it is a moment when a lot of people around the world will be looking to us to see what type of country we want to be in the world. And we are one of the very few countries that has always championed democratic values and the security that's needed to underpin them. And the Royal Navy has an absolutely critical role in doing that.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are justifiable concerns that if Iran resumes its nuclear programme, there will be an arms race in the Middle East, with other countries, especially Saudi Arabia, scrambling to build its own nuclear weapons. Can the Foreign Secretary tell us what the government will do to address that risk?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes, continue to support the Iran nuclear deal, despite the pressure that it is evidently under. Do everything we can to persuade Iran not to enrich its uranium towards the 20% level, which is the real tipping point from where they would be able to develop nuclear weapons relatively quickly, and work with as many other countries as we can to try and get them to support us in those endeavours.
Mr. Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What discussions is the Foreign Secretary having with our allies in the Gulf, who've been warning about Iranian activities for years now, and also with Qatar, who maintain rather closer relationships with Tehran, but of course rely on the Straits of Hormuz being open to ship their cargoes of LNG also to the UK?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, first of all, the point he makes about Qatar is very, very important, because LNG is absolutely critical to the global economy, and that's one of the main reasons, alongside oil, that we have to maintain freedom of navigation. So we have very good discussions with Qatar and all our allies in the Gulf, and we are expecting strong support from them.
Mr. Graham P. Jones.
The Foreign Secretary mentioned Iran's malign interventions in the region. Mr. Speaker, while the House may be concerned about the Straits, quite rightly, of Hormuz, last week saw the release of terrifying videos from Yemen, the Iranian-backed Houthis, with 300 training camps, jihadi training camps, for young boys aged between 8 and 18, chanting "Death to America, death to Israel, curse on the Jews, victory to Islam." Add that to last week the $430,000 donation to Hezbollah. Add to that last week also the drone attacks with Iranian technology, and add to that the 30 academics and opposition who've been summarily sentenced to death in Yemen by the Iranian-backed Houthis. I've got to say to the Foreign Secretary, in summary, does he accept that the tanker crisis is just part of the problem in the Gulf region involving Iran, and we have to take a broader brush to this issue, not just focus on the tanker crisis because it affects us directly?
Foreign Secretary.
Yes, and he's absolutely right. And he speaks very powerfully of one region and one country where we see the malign impact of Iranian sponsorship, and we are doing everything we can in Yemen. We have, I think, against expectations, managed to get a peace process going in Yemen, and one of the main hopes we have is that will decouple the Houthis from their Iranian paymasters, so that they can take part in a government of national unity and contribute more constructively than the way he's been talking about to peace in Yemen, because I think what he said is very worrying.
James Heapy.
Thank you, sir. Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his earlier answers to the members for Basildon, Billericay and North East Hertfordshire, with which I completely agree. I know he's nervous of straying out of lane, but does he agree that the Royal Navy is not just about power projection? It has an important diplomatic role as well, and therefore it's not just our defence policy, but our foreign policy that is greatly enhanced by a larger surface fleet.
Secretary.
Yes, and I wish I'd made more of my strong agreement with what he's just said in the last few months, but let me just, as we've been talking a lot about the Gulf and he's mentioned the Navy, let me just talk about a couple of other areas where I think we could do with a stronger Royal Navy presence, and one of them is the Arctic. And the other is the Indo-Pacific region, and I think both of those regions, it would send a very strong signal about British national self-confidence if we had the naval capacity we'd all want.
Oh, very good. The Foreign Secretary's not that bothered about straying out of lane. He's going from one region to the other. And this is all very encouraging. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary, thank you for your statement. I note in your statement that you say that whilst HMS Duncan has been dispatched to the Gulf, it is there to take over from HMS Montrose. So we're still going to finish up with one destroyer covering 19,000 nautical miles, having to escort an average of 3 vessels per day. Are we so bereft of naval power that we cannot send an additional ship to the area and have to rely on other European nations who haven't divvied up so far? Or is this a decision that has been made so that we don't annoy the Iranians?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I congratulate him on his eagle eye and spotting that detail, but I do want to reassure him, first of all, that when HMS Duncan arrives, Montrose will not be going out of service immediately, so there will be a period, particularly this extremely dangerous period in the next few weeks, when they will be operating together. Secondly, that we will get Montrose back into service as quickly as we can. And thirdly, that Montrose is actually based in Bahrain, so it is going to stay in the region for its refitting and refuelling, so it won't be far away.
James Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Foreign Secretary for his tone during this statement? But would he agree with me that this act of piracy represents a pattern of behaviour from the Iranians, both directly and through their proxies, in an overall strategy to achieve regional hegemony in the Middle East? And what we urgently need is a strategy which restores that balance so that the Iranians can't take advantage of our strategic weaknesses.
Well, he's absolutely right. And I think that people who have been studying that region for longer than I have would say that there is no issue with Iran being a regional power, and a great regional power, but it's whether it is a great regional military power that is the issue, and it is Iran's military presence in so many other parts of the region which is so destabilising, which is the root cause of many of the problems, and so I think he's absolutely right to focus on that.
Alex Chalk.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Iran and Iran alone is responsible for the illegal seizure of the Stena Impero, and the Foreign Secretary has made that crystal clear. But can he also be clear that if the notice of passage had been given as requested, that HMS Montrose would have been better able to protect that vessel?
Foreign Secretary.
He is absolutely right. And when the Stena Impero was taken, Montrose was actually only 20 minutes away. So she was trying very hard to get there on time. So I hope one of the sort of consequences of the terrible incident that's happened is that ship owners will give us the notice that we ask for when they're transiting their ships.
John Lamont.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's statement and the actions the government is taking to try and address this crisis. But does he agree with me that the priority now should be the safe return of the crew and the British registered vessel?
Absolutely. And, what we want is secure freedom of navigation for the thousands of ships that are passing through the region every year. If we have that ship returned, if the crew are released, and if we are confident that we are returning to a stable situation, then we will, of course, review the military measures that we've announced today to see whether they are still necessary.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Secretary of State for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. Secretary Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and with your permission I would like to